Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. In this crash course, we are going to be covering Framer Motion, which is a really cool motion library for React applications. And essentially what Framer Motion does is it allows us to create these really cool, smooth, complex animations with very simple and a small amount of code. And you can just go to the Framer Motion website and you can see all of the cool animations that you can perform, and this is really easy. So let's actually just scroll through. Let's see if you can have any other examples. Like we have this over here, and you can see the block of code is very small, whereas usually animations like these would take a lot more code and a lot more complexity. Similarly over here we can have drag events, and then there's other kind of examples that we have over here, and we're going to cover a lot of them. Now in this crash course, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be working with a bunch of different boxes, and we're going to be working on animating these boxes in different ways. Now at the end of the day, you can use all these animation principles that we learned through these boxes to build applications exactly like this. But just for simplicity's sake, we're just going to work on the animation principles. But again, you can use these principles to create real-life applications like the ones that are featured over here in the examples. So let's just quickly illustrate some of the different animations. So the first box that we're going to animate is this one over here. So you can see here that it's a little bit lighter than this box. And when I click on it, I want you to look, you'll definitely see what happens. So when I click on this box, we get this really cool kind of rolling animation, and it got darker. So it rolled all the way over here and it got darker. If I click on it again, you can see it rolls back, and I can click on it. And you know, this can be really cool and fun. Now this is actually, you can think of this as a relatively complex animation, but with Framer Motion the code is very simple and easy. Alright, and now we have this animation. So when we hover over it, we have this really cool kind of animation. We can also click on it, and the cool thing is we can also drag it. So we can drag it and it kind of goes back to the correct location. Now we can also look at this animation. This animation, I'm going to have to require a refresh. You can see it pops in, and then the other ones, they pop in at a different time. And this can be really cool to create maybe something that looks a little like this. Let's go to the docs, and let's go to some of the examples, and maybe like something like this. So this can animate, and it can propagate all of these other ones. This one is a little bit faster, but the principle is relatively the same. So this one animates in, and then the other ones kind of propagate in as well. Alright, and then we can also create cool animations like this one over here. This one is also, this is a keyframe animation, and this is really simple to do with Framer Motion, even though it looks relatively complex. And then the last one, and this one's my favorite, is I have all these buttons that are basically going to trigger this box to animate. So if I want to move it to the right, we can move it to the right. If I want to move it to the left, I can move it to the left. If I want to turn it into a circle, I can turn it into a circle. Turn it into a square, I can turn it into a square. And the cool thing about this is you can do more than one. So move to the right and turn it to the square. Move to the left, square, then back to a circle. Square, circle. So I can do circle and then square, circle, square. And I can move to the right, move to the left, circle. I can do all these things. And I can even move it to the left, turn it, or move it to the right, turn it into a square, and then just stop it midway. And then I can do, okay, now turn it to a full circle, move it to the left, stop it, maybe turn it into a square, stop it. So I can actually stop the animation wherever I want, which is really cool. And so once you learn all these principles, you'll be able to really apply them into your own application. And what's great about this is we're going to build everything from scratch. And the reason for this is because this is really simple. Even the CSS we're going to do from scratch. So all you really need to know for this crash course is basic HTML and CSS, as well as React, of course, because this is a library for animating React applications. So you do need to know at least the basics of React, know how React components work, and know how props work. Really, that's pretty much all you have to know for React. But if you don't know any React, I don't suggest watching this crash course. Anyways, if you guys are excited, then we will be moving on to the next video. We'll be working on our very first box. Okay, in this section, we are going to set up our Framer Motion React application. Now, of course, for this, we're going to need to create a React app. And again, I do expect you to know how to do this, but in case for some odd reason you don't, all you have to do is just go to your terminal, cd into whatever directory you want your React application to reside in, and just do a simple npx create React app, and then give your React app a name. You can call it something like Framer Motion App or something like that, whatever it is that you want to call it. So that right there will create the React application. It will take a little bit to run. Now, one thing to note is that you absolutely need to have Node.js installed if you want to execute this command, because it is using npx. So if you don't have Node.js installed, very easy installation, whatever operating system you're in, just go to nodejs.com or whatever it is, and then just do a quick installation. It's not a very complicated installation. So once you have created this React app, what I want you to do is to move into that directory inside of the terminal. And then I want you to install Framer Motion, because Framer Motion is an NPM package for React applications. So once you move into that directory by doing something like cd and then whatever you called it, do npm install and then Framer Motion. And this is the only package that we need to install to get set up with our project and to create all these powerful React animations. So that is simply all you have to do. Once that is done, what you can do is spin up your application by doing npm start, and it should essentially go over here to localhost 3000. Now, I suggest opening up your application in Visual Studio Code. This is the text editor that we are going to be using, and I'm using the integrated terminal. I basically did an npm start and it started it up at localhost 3000. Now, the first thing that we are going to do is go to the app.js file and just completely remove this header. And then we're also going to go to the app.css file and just completely remove everything in here. And then in the index.css, we're just going to add some styles. Actually, what we're going to do is we're going to add that in the app.css. So we're going to do star. And then these are just some simple styles that are going to apply to every single element inside of our application. This really doesn't have to do with Framer Motion, but it's just going to make styling our application a lot easier. So we're going to say that any element is going to have 0 margin as well as 0 padding, unless of course we specify it. And then we want a box sizing of border box, and this basically ensures that the size of our box will stay consistent regardless if we add padding or margin. So that is pretty much all the setup that we have. If you refresh, you should be able to see this empty page. And now let's actually go ahead and let's start working on our very first animation. Let's go ahead and let's start working on animating our very first box. Now, a quick reminder, our very first box will look a little something like this. And once we click on it, you can see how that animation moves. Now, when we click on it again, it moves back to the right, back to the left. Now, let's just talk about the different animations that are going on here. The first animation that is very, very clear is, well, it is changing location. So it used to be here and then it goes over here, and that's just one quick animation. Another animation, and this might be a little bit subtle, is basically the opacity of this box is changing. You can see it's a little bit lighter when it's on the left, but when we click on it, it gets a little bit darker. And if you kind of notice, in the meanwhile, it's getting a little bit lighter as we go along. So it's not something that happens right away. And then another thing is of course, we have this cool rolling effect. And the last thing is we kind of have like this little knockback, springy, kind of real-time animation, which makes things really, really cool. So we're going to talk about how we can do this animation, and it's actually really, really simple with Framer Motion. So let's actually go ahead into our actual React application. So I have this actually opened up in localhost 3001. Our actual app is in localhost 3000. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to create that box. What I suggest doing is just creating another component And we're going to be placing all of our boxes in the app.js file. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create basically a folder, a directory called components. And in here, we're going to place all of our boxes. So let's create a box1 component. And then in here, we're going to have a box1.jsx. So let's go here and we have a box1.jsx. Now inside of this component directory, we can also put a box2 because we're going to use that a little bit later, and a box3 and a box4 and a box5. But for now, let's just create our very first box. Now this is going to be a very simple React component. I like to use this extension over here, ES6 React Snippets, which allows me to have these snippets over here, just define RFC, and this was going to go ahead and just give me a functional component. All right, cool. So now what we can do is we can just go ahead in here and just import that box. So we can say box1, and you can see that that functional component basically used the file name to create the component itself. We can say import box1 from, well, dash components, and then dash, well, box1, and then the JSX element right over here. And we can basically say, hey, please just place box1 right in there. Now, of course, you're not going to see anything different because, well, there's no box in here at the moment. So let's create a box. So the first thing I want to do is just create a simple container that basically holds the box. So let's just give it a class name of box container. Box container. And then in here, we're actually going to have the box itself. So this is going to be a div. And then we're going to give this a class name of box. So we're going to give this a quick class name of box. And now let's actually go ahead and let's just apply some very, very simple styles. So inside of the app.css, what we are going to do is we are going to go to there, and then we're going to say, okay, well, the box container, and I'm only going to give the box container a padding bottom of 20 rems. So we can have basically that space in between each box. So this space right over here. And now what we're going to do is we are going to go and just style our very simple box. So our box, let's just give it a width of 20 rems. We're going to give it a height of 20 rems. And this will give it, well, of course, a width and a height of 20 rems. We're also going to give it a background color of aquarium. Let's also give it a display of flex. We're going to need this a little bit later. If you don't know this, that's fine. Just really understand these styles. Width of 25, height of 25, and a background color. The other styles you don't really have to worry about if you don't understand them. We'll just do it flex direction of column, align item of center, and a justify content of center. And that's it. So justify content of center. So those are the styles that we are going to be applying to this particular element right over here. So now if we go to our page, you can see that we have our styles, which is, well, great. Now one thing is I probably want to have that kind of padding throughout our little app over here. So what I'm going to do is inside of the app.css, I'm just going to do app, and I'm just going to give it a little bit of padding of 5 rem, something like that. And now if I go over here, you can see, okay, that is terrific. That's exactly what we want. All right, so now what do we want to do? Well, we want to animate this. When we click on it, we want to perform these animations. So let's actually start off simple. Let's say I don't want to click on it. Let's just say I just wanted to animate right away and perform this animation. Okay, so perform this animation. So just like that. So let's actually start off with something very simple. Let's actually just move this box from the left to the right. That's all that we want to do. We don't want to perform any of the other complex animations. Well, how do we do that? Well, doing that is very, very simple with Framer Motion. So the first thing what we have to do is we have to define which HTML element we ultimately want to animate. And we do that with the motion keyword in Framer Motion. So what we would do is we would import something from Framer Motion. So we can say Framer Motion. And then what we're going to say is we want to import motion. And basically, we can use this variable right over here to define which element we ultimately want to animate. So we want to animate this box over here. Now, how do we use this to basically define that we want to animate this div element? Well, we would just do something like this: motion and then dot div. Now this works with anything. We can do motion dot anchor tag, motion dot image. It doesn't matter what HTML element it is. Essentially, what this motion is doing is defining that, hey, we want to ultimately animate this HTML element or this JSX element. So we also have to define it. If we have a closing tag, it has to also have to be motion.div. And right there, that does nothing. All this says is that, hey, we want to animate this, but now we still have to define the actual animation. So how do we define the animation? Now, when we basically append this or prepend this motion variable right over here, what we are basically doing is injecting it with a bunch of different props that we can define. So now what we can do in here is define a few props, and the most important prop that we are able to define is the animate prop. So we can go over here and then we can say animate. Now the animate prop is going to take an object. So let's actually define an object in here, and then the object is going to take a bunch of key value pairs. Now the key is going to be whatever it is that we want to animate. So whether it is the color, the opacity, the position, whatever it is that we want to animate, and the value is, okay, how we want to animate it. For instance, right over here, we want to animate basically this element so that it moves to the right. So essentially we do that with X. And this basically means that, hey, we are going to move, basically move in the X direction. Now, how much do we want to move in the X direction? Well, we define that as the value. So I can say here, 1,750 pixels. Now, that I'm only using this big number because I have a really large 27-inch iMac, but maybe you want to do something else. Maybe this will actually move out of the viewport. Now over here you can just define a number, but you can also define a string. You can say something like 100 VW, and then over here you can see, if I refresh this, you can see it actually moves all the way out of the page, and it's really fast. So this actual animation happens right away, right from the beginning. And we actually have no absolute control of it at the moment. So you can see here that you can define it any way you want. You can also make it rems if you want to. So you can refresh that, and you can see here you have this really quick animation. You can also make this pixels. You can make this whatever it is that you want to, as well as you can just define a number. I'm going to define 1,700. You can see here we get this really cool animation, and we get this really cool like springy feature over here, and I'll talk about that a little bit, but this is a really cool animation. Okay, cool. So we were able to do this. Now let's actually start talking about, okay, well, we also want to animate the opacity. The opacity, it seems like it starts a little bit lighter and then it gets darker, so we want to animate that. So over here, the opacity in the beginning, let's actually talk about this. The opacity in the beginning is actually 0.5. So it's 0.5 transparent. And then over here, it is ultimately 1. So it's not transparent at all. So how do we do this? Well, you might say, okay, in this animate, we also want to animate the opacity. The opacity. And we're going to say that we want it to be 1. And this actually works completely fine. Except initially, and if you might not be able to know this because it's so fast, initially the box already has an opacity of 1. Now we can fix that by basically, I don't know, giving it a style, maybe giving a style, an initial style, or in our box class we can give it a style of opacity of 0. Let's just make it 0.2 just so we can really see it. So you can, yeah, you might be able to notice that right there. You can see that it's lighter. So that's one way we can basically fix this. Another way that we can fix this is by using another prop. And the other prop is called the initial prop. And this basically says, in the initial of the animation, what are the styles? So we can basically say that, hey, I want the opacity to be 0.5 initially. So now what we can basically go over here And you can, if you notice, let's actually make this like really light. Let's make it 0.1. Now, if you be careful, and we'll talk about how we can actually change the speed of an animation in a little bit, but you can see here that initially it's 0.1, and then it's getting more and more dark. So that is the initial prop. Okay, cool. Now let's actually talk about how we can slow down this animation. This is a really slow, really fast and kind of animation. I'm really not liking it, to be quite honest. So how do we slow this down? Well, we can slow this down by another prop, and this is going to be called the transition prop. And again, this is also going to take an object, and there's a few values in here. And now one value that is very important is the duration. And now I'm going to change this later on to something else called stiffness, but for now I'm just going to say that the duration, let's make it 2 seconds. So now what we can do is we can refresh this, and you can see that we can actually control that duration. Now, one thing that I'm noticing is that we don't get that really cool kind of like physics effect over here. And if you don't remember, that springy effect. So let's just get rid of that duration. And you can see here that we get kind of this like knockback effect, which is really cool, and I really enjoy that. And the reason for this is because when we define the duration, we also automatically define the type of the animation to be called tween. And a tween is basically an animation that is just kind of straight, and there's no real like physics behind it. So if I were to make this a little bit faster, maybe 1 second, you can see here that it goes here and it stops. Personally, I don't really like this animation. I like the spring animation. So this is called spring. Now the problem is that you can't use the spring animation with the duration. So how do we go ahead and make things a little bit faster and slower? Well, to do this we use stiffness. So stiffness is for the spring type, whereas duration is for the tween type. Now the stiffness, it basically defines how stiff that spring is going to be. Now by default I believe it is 100, but you can make it higher. Now if you make it higher, if I were to refresh this, you can see how it's not that stiff. You can see here that you have a huge kind of knockback effect. Now let's make this even 1,000, and you can see here it's so fast and it's not stiff at all. We have this huge knockback effect. Now if you want to make it more stiff, well, you would just decrease it. And by making it more stiff, you're actually decreasing the duration of this. So this actually looks a little bit better to me. But if I want, I can actually make it more stiff. Maybe I'll make it like 60 or something. So over here, you can see here that it's very stiff, and therefore it's slower and there's a little bit less knockback. So I like this, and that's what I'm going to be using. All right, cool. Now, there's so many different things inside of this transition that we can use. We can use also damping, which is something I would like you guys to kind of look into. There's many different things. Now, let's actually explore damping a little bit. Let's do damping, and let's do damping of 100. Let's refresh this. And you can see here that it really slows it down. So if you really want it to kind of slow down, you can really use damping if you want to. So you can kind of explore with stiffness and a little bit of damping to really get the speed that you ultimately want. So if you decrease the damping, let's see how it looks like. You can see that you get this really kind of wanky animation. So you can really kind of play around with whatever it is that you want. Let's see, 75. Yeah, you can always play around with it. I believe the default is 10, so maybe you can go with 5 if you want to, and you can kind of play around with it however way you want to. I'm gonna completely get rid of it. Another thing is, well, there's a bunch of other things, and you can kind of always hover through them and read the documentation with the transition, but I'm not going to be able to cover them all in this crash course because I don't want to make it extremely long. Now, one thing that I also want to quickly note is that these properties over here, most of them are just simple CSS properties. So we can have something like background color, and we can basically say the background color, we want to ultimately change it to, I don't know, let's say blue. Now we can go ahead and we can say blue, and If I were to refresh, you can see we also get our blue animation on there. So most of these key value pairs are just CSS properties that are camel cased. However, obviously X is a little bit different. X is just a special case for framer motion, and essentially what it does is just defines the X. And of course, as you can imagine, we also have a Y value. And that's just in case we want to animate things in the Y direction. But most of the time, they're just simple CSS values. Also, we have something called scale, which I'm sure is not a CSS value, but you can probably imagine what this does. It basically increases it. This increases the box by 2 times of what it already was. So if I were to refresh this, you can see that we get this kind of animation. So again, these are just CSS values, so you can pretty much explore whatever it is that you want to use. Alright, so the last thing is I want to have this really cool rolling effect, because, well, remember we have this really cool rolling effect. To do that, very, very easy. We just define rotate, and we say that, hey, we want you to rotate 360 degrees. So now what we can do is we can say, in here, you can see we get that really cool rolling animation. Alright, cool. So that is pretty much that. So now what we want to do is we want to ultimately be able to control the animation. We don't want the animation to occur right away. So what do we do for that? Well, what we can do is simple React to kind of control the animation that we ultimately want to perform. So we can have a useState hook, and we can basically use that hook to control these particular values. Now later in the section, I'll show you a different way of doing it and controlling the animation through kind of a built-in framer motion component. But for now, let's just use a simple useState hook. So let's go ahead and let's say const, and let's just say animate, and then say set animate, and we'll just make this a true or false value. And maybe we'll actually call this is animate, so, or is animating, and then set is animating. And then initially we'll say use state. And this is just a way that we can store state in the component level. And initially we'll just set this to false. We'll set it to false. Okay, cool. So now basically what we can do is essentially what we can say is, okay, when we click on this, we're going to basically toggle this from true to false. So in here, we can say on click, and again, this is just simple React. We can just say, hey, set is animating to whatever set animating is not. So to the opposite of is animating. So that's over here, we're saying that, okay, if is animating is true, we want to basically make the opposite of it, so false. Now if is animating is false, then we want to set the opposite of it is true. So that's all that is doing. And then in here, basically what we can say is, okay, is it animating? And then we can have just some simple ternary operator. If it is animating, I want you to go to 750. If it's not, then stay at 0. And then similarly over here, what we can basically do is say, okay, if it is animating, we want the opacity to be 1. And then if it's not, then ultimately what we want is the opacity to be 0. Or sorry, 0.5. 0.5. And then similarly over here, the very last thing, if it's animating, we want to rotate it 360 degrees. If it's not, we don't want to rotate it at all. So now we can go ahead and save this. Now again, this is a very React way of doing it. Later on, I'll show you a different way of doing it, so don't worry all too much about it. But now if you click on it, we can see that we get that cool animation. And again, this is something that we could apply to any kind of application that we want to. Again, you're not going to be creating a box for your application that animates like this, but you can see how powerful this animation can be inside of a real React application. So I hope that kind of clears everything up. I hope that makes sense, and I hope that kind of introduces the real main components of framer motion. So we have this over here, which is motion, and then essentially we just basically prepend this to whatever element that we want to animate. So we do motion.div. And then we basically get access to a lot of different props. And these are the main props that we're ultimately going to be using. The animate prop, the initial prop, as well as the transition prop. The animate prop just defines how we are going to be animating our element. The initial prop is going to define the initial styles of our element before we animate it. And then the transition is going to define the type as well as the duration, or in this case, the stiffness. So that is pretty much it. Really, really simple. And we were able to create this really complex animation with, what, 30 lines of code, and some of this code was just basically import statements. So it's pretty surreal how powerful this can be. Now, I hope you guys learned a lot. In the next section, we're going to be learning how we can create this one. So this box, when we hover over it, we get this cool hover effect, and we can also get this kind of cool tapping effect. And we also have this dragging feature. And drag and drop is usually really, really infamously hard to do. Not with framer motion though. So we'll talk about that next. In this section, we are going to animate our second box, and by doing so, we're going to introduce two new concepts. The concept of events, as well as, of course, the concept of dragging elements. Now, dragging elements, I'm sure that is pretty clear. It's just the ability to kind of move an element around and drag it around to a specified location. That is very easy. Now, events is basically an event that we perform, and once we perform this event, we want to animate our element. For instance, an event that I perform is hovering over this particular box. So once I hover over it, I perform this event and I want to basically animate it, and you can see that it gets a little bit bigger. Another event is actually clicking on this. So when I click on it, you can see that it gets a little bit smaller, and we get this kind of cool click event. So that is basically what we are going to be doing right over here with this box. So let's go ahead and let's do that. So let's go here and let's just create our second box. So inside the box2 directory, let's create box.jsx. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just simply copy and paste everything in here into here. And simply what I'm going to do is just remove all of these props except for the class name. So that's the only thing that I'm going to keep. And I'm going to get rid of this use state hook. So over here, we should basically, once we go to our app.js and we basically import box2. So let's import box2 from box2. And over here, we can basically put in box2, or box2 rather, not box. You can see here that we should have our second box. So we have our second box, which is awesome. So now the first thing that I want to do is I want to basically create these animations over here. So when I hover over it, I want to have this animation, and then when I click on it, I want to have this animation. Now you might be thinking, okay, we can really do this easily with CSS. So we can basically add, something like inside of the CSS, we can have I don't know, maybe box.hover, something like this, hover. So once I hover over it, I want to increase the size of our box, and then you can perform, of course, some styles. Now, there's actually a much easier way of doing that in Framer Motion, and of course, that is going to be inside of the props. So there's a bunch of props, and you can actually see the props, well, right over here. So when we do while, you can see all of the different props that we have. You can see here while hover, I want to perform some sort of animation. While I focus, I want to perform an animation. While drag, while tap. And there's a few more. The problem is I don't remember them, but there's a few more animations, and I believe if you actually just kind of hover over it or read the documentation, you can see some of the other animation or events that you could use. So I'm going to do while hover. So essentially what I'm going to do is while hover, and then in here, that's going to take in an object of all the different styles that I want to ultimately change when I perform the hover event. In this case, I just want to increase the size of the box. So I can say scale it 1.1. So this basically says that, hey, we want it to be 1.1 times larger than it originally is. So basically 10% larger about. So now over here, what we can do is when we hover over it, you can see that we get that effect. Okay, cool. That's awesome. And of course, now what we can do is we can add another event. We can say, okay, while tap. So if we click on it, what we can say is, okay, well, I want to decrease the size a little bit. So I want to decrease the size to 0.9. So now it's basically 10% smaller than what it used to be. So now you can see here, and then when you click on it, you get that cool effect. So very, very similar to what we have here. So it's, yeah, that's pretty much it. That's really, really easy. And you can, again, you can have different effects over here. So now let's talk about how we can make this draggable. So you can see this one's draggable, but this one of course isn't. You can't drag it. Now to make it draggable, it's extremely easy. All you have to do is add the drag prop, and that's it. That's all you have to do. Add the drag prop, and now it's draggable. You can see it's draggable. And what's cool is you can actually just, you can see it kind of has that really cool effect over here. You can even push it out of the screen if you want to. Now, obviously, this is ultimately not something that you want to have inside of your application. You don't want to kind of have this free range dragging. So you might want to constrict it. So you might want to say something like, okay, I want you to only be able to drag it in the X direction. So you can see here now, if I try to drag up, you can see I can only drag to the X direction. So either left or right. Similarly, we can say drag Y, and then now we can only drag Y. If we want to be able to drag both X and Y, then we will just say drag on its own. So drag on its own. And that's ultimately what I want to do. I want to give them the flexibility to drag it however way they want. But what I want to do is I want to basically restrict the kind of the how much they can drag it. So remember, the initial location is over here. I don't want them to be able to drag it all the way over here and basically just move the thing out of the screen. So basically what I can say is define some drag constraints. And you can see that there's a bunch of drag props that we can say. And I suggest if you are really looking into working with the drag and drop feature, really start learning these. But the main one I want to talk about is the drag constraint. And this is going to take in an object. And this object only has 4 values that it can take: left, right, top, or bottom. And essentially what this is going to do is ultimately constrain how much you can move that particular element to the left, to the right, to the top, to the bottom. For instance, let's say right, and let's just say 20. So 20 to the right. So now what I can do, if I decide, of course I can still move it anywhere I want, but if I move it to the right, you can see that it's a little bit constricted and actually moves a little bit back to where it ultimately was. So you can see here that there's a little bit of restriction. I can't move it all the way to the right anymore, and that's because we have some constraints. Now, of course, we can do this with the left as well. Now, the left, you can say negative 20. So you can see here. You can see here that I mean, it's a little bit difficult because this is already at the left, but you can see it's moving a little bit back. Now, if we go to the top or the bottom, you can see that it just goes completely away. We can also add that to the top. Let's just say 10 to the top, or even 5 to the top and the bottom. Let's say we want to restrict that access as much as possible from in the Y direction. So let's go here, and you can see very restricted, and it actually moves back to ultimately that particular location. All right, cool. So that's pretty much it for the drag and drop feature, and that's pretty much it for this box. In the next box, we are going to be using this. This is a really cool box, and this is a really cool animation because you can basically see, okay, it moves in initially, and then we have other elements that move in one at a time after this element was introduced. So over here we have this parent element, and in here we have a bunch of children elements, and these children elements are sibling to one another. And you can see here that we have that initial animation, and then we have this animation. So we're going to do that in the next section, and we're going to introduce other concepts of framer motion. Okay, so now let's move on to the third box, and this box we're going to be introducing a new concept called variance, and variance is a really important concept in framer motion. So again, just to quickly illustrate what's happening here inside of the third box, what is happening is if we refresh, we get this initial animation, and then we have these children also propagating in. And we can do this through variants. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to create that box. So let's go over here and let's create a new box directory. So inside of the component directory, let's create box3. And then in here, let's create box3.jsx. And in here, let's just do a quick, simple copy and paste. And we're going to copy and paste this. We're going to call this box3. Over here, I believe I didn't change this to box2. So let's change that to box2. Doesn't really matter. It won't really affect it. But now what we can do is let's just get rid of all these styles except for the box itself. And let's get rid of this. Okay, cool. So the first thing that I want to do is, of course, import this in here and actually display it. So box3, and notice that it actually auto imported. So now if we go over here, we should see our box. Of course, nothing is animating. So now what we want to do is we want to basically animate this in initially. So you might be thinking, okay, well, that's pretty easy to do. We can just have an animate prop and an initial prop. Maybe the initial prop is out of the screen and then we want to animate it back into the screen. Just to show you how easy that is to do, we can just go to box3. We can just do something like animate, and we can say that we want the X to be basically the position that it's in right now, but initially we want it to be X maybe is -100. So if we go back to our application and hover, you can see we get this effect. You can maybe make this even like 1,000 just to really get it out of the screen. And you can see here that we get that effect. This is really easy, but you can see that it kind of gets a little bit messy every single time we have to put the animate and the initial, and this gets really, really messy. And so a better way of doing it is actually using the variant, so the variant prop. And basically with the variant prop, essentially what we can do is predefine our styles, and then we can say, hey, what variant we ultimately want to display. So, for example, what we can do here is we can basically say const list variant, or let's just say box variant. So box variant, and this is just going to be a simple object. And this object is going to contain a key value pair where the key is just any arbitrary name that we define, and then the value is basically an object that contains the styles. So we can call this anything that we want. We can call it a lion if we want to, and we can say, okay, well, we want these styles. Now obviously this name doesn't really mean much and we should probably change it, but we can say that, okay, well, we want 100, we want the scale to be 1.5. And over here, what we can do now is instead of having animate, what we can basically say is animate, and instead of having that object, we can basically say, hey, we want to animate this right over here, the lion variant. So the first thing that we have to do is define the variant that we ultimately want to use. So we can say we want to basically use this variant, which is again an object of objects, and then inside of this variant we want to use the lion basically properties. So over here we can say lion. So if we go here, you can see that we have that kind of initial animation. Now over here we can have another object if we want to, and we can say elephant if we want to. And these are really stupid names and I wouldn't really call them, but just to illustrate that they can be really called whatever it is that we want. Maybe this one we move it 1000 and we make it smaller, so the scale is this. So right now it's still going to be using the lion because the animate is using this object right over here, but we can also say elephant now. So we can basically say elephant, and you can see that we get this animation. So now we're using elephant. So that is basically variants in a nutshell, and that's actually just a better way of doing things rather than basically just adding the styles in here. Now what's nice is you can actually basically use the same principle with the initial. So instead of having the object, you can basically say, okay, initially I want it to be lion, and then I want to animate it to elephant. So you can basically say that initially I want it to be this really large thing, and I want to animate it to elephant. And just to kind of illustrate this, let's just make the background color yellow, for instance, just to really illustrate that this is how it works. So you can see here, it's yellow, and I guess it stays yellow because we're not animating the end, the elephant, we're not animating that to be aqua green, I think, or what was it called again? Let's just say green, for instance. So you can see here, starts off as yellow, and it's kind of ugly, but you get what I mean. So that is basically variants in a nutshell. Now variants are very, very powerful, and they allow us to do multiple different things. So let's actually go ahead and let's just completely get rid of this variant. Let's just get rid of it for now, and let's just get rid of these two, and let's just go ahead and let's just create so weird animation. Okay, let's go ahead and let's create those boxes, those little boxes over here. And to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a use state hook. So I'm going to say boxes, and I'm going to say set boxes. And then I'm just going to define the boxes in the use state hook, wherever that is, use state hook. And this is just going to be an array of boxes. So we're going to say that the ID of the box is 1. We don't really need this. And that's pretty much it. That's actually really all that we need. Actually, you know what? Let's actually not use a use state hook. Let's just make things a lot simpler. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply have an array of 3 numbers. So 3 numbers. And I'm going to iterate through each number. So I'm going to map through each number. And for each number, I'm going to say that, hey, this is a box. And basically, ultimately, what I want to do is I want to return a list element. So I'm going to return a list element. And that's pretty much it. And let's just give this list element a class name of box item. So we're going to call this box item. So very, very simple animation. Let's actually take this class of box item. Let's go over here and let's just do some styling. So the box item is going to have, let's see, we're going to make it a box, of course. So we're going to need a width of, let's make it a small box, 0.5 rems, as well as a height of 0.5 rems. And then we're also going to give it a background color of white. And then we're also going to give it a little bit of padding. Why not? And then let's also give it list styles of none, because it's going to be a list and I don't want those list styles. Let's also give it some margin of 0.5 rem. So now if we go back here, we should see all of these boxes. If I hover, of course, there is still no animation. So now let's actually perform this animation, but let's actually use the variants that we talked about. So let's actually talk about essentially what this animation is doing. So initially, basically what's happening is it's not present initially. So first of all, it's not present, and then it gets present. So let's actually create a box variant. Let's go over here and let's create const box variant, and this is going to be an object. And initially, the first state we're going to say hidden. And basically, in hidden, we're going to say that, hey, the x value is, let's actually use a string this time, is negative 100 VW. So that is the initial state. And then the visible state, let's say that this is going to be x of 0. So this is just going back to our particular location. So again, now what we can say is we want to use this particular variant, the box variant. So we can say box variant, and then what we can basically say is, okay, well, we want you to animate it to visible. We want you to animate it to visible, but initially we want it to be hidden. So initially we want it to be hidden. So this is very, very simple. So now what we can basically do is you can see, oh, that's the wrong one. You can basically see we have our element. Okay, cool. So that is working fine and dandy. And now one thing that is really cool is inside of the variant, we can also add the transition. So we can also add the transition if we want to. And over here, we can say that, hey, maybe what I want is a delay. This is something that we didn't talk about, but we can also say, hey, we want a delay of 5 500 milliseconds, half a second. Just to kind of illustrate this to you, let's just have 3 seconds. And you can see if I hover, if I refresh this, there's actually a delay, a 3-second delay for when the animation is occurring. So for now, let's just do half a second. And let's just refresh this, and you can see that we get this really cool delay. Now let's start working on animating this over here. So we want to animate this, and then we want to animate these elements, these child elements. Right now it's just animating together. Now to animate this, of course, now what we have to do is basically append that or prepend that motion right over here. So motion dot the li element. So now if we were to refresh this, you can see here that it's working completely fine. Now one thing that is cool, okay, so this is really cool to note, is that the parent, so basically the parent, if it contains the variant, essentially what happens is any child that has this motion dot within it is also going to have animate visible and then initial of hidden. So whatever the animate and the initial is of the parent that has a variant is also going to be inside of this child as well. So to kind of illustrate this, and this might be a little bit confusing. So this will be confusing, believe me. It's not the most intuitive thing to understand. But to kind of illustrate this, what really happens behind the scenes is, let's move this over here. What happens behind the scenes is because this is a child and it has a motion dot of this parent, what happens is the animate and the initial of this will also be animate and initial. However, the variant is not going to be the exact same variant. And actually what we can basically do at this point is define a new set of variants. So we can say it's basically list variant, and over here we can basically have the same properties. Now we're gonna have to have a key value pair of hidden and visible so that it can ultimately be used by it, but essentially we can have different styles. So let's actually copy this, and now over here we can have different styles. So for instance, you can basically say that, okay, well, we don't want it to be completely out of the page, maybe we just want it to be negative 10. And then over here, maybe we can say that we want the opacity to be initially, when it's hidden, 0. Okay. And then over here in visible, what we can basically do is say, well, what we want to do is we want the opacity to be 1 when it's nice and visible. And let's give it a delay of, I don't know, 1 second. So over here we have a delay of half a second. Over here we have a delay of 1 second. So over here, what we can basically do is give it a variant, define what variant this is using. So we can do list variant. Now over here, we're basically, again, defining that this is visible and hidden. But again, we don't have to do this because over here in the parent, what's happening is this is going to essentially add these props over here with the exact same value. So we can actually get rid of this if we want to. I hope that makes sense. It's kind of a difficult idea to grasp. But now what we can do is we can basically see that animation, and then we see this come in. And the reason why this is happening is because, again, behind the scenes, it has the animate of visible and the initial of hidden, except now it's using the variant list variant. So it's a completely different variant. And the delay is 1 second, whereas this is delay of 0.5 seconds. So you can see here that we get this really kind of cool animation. Now, let's say that, okay, this is cool, but I don't want to basically provide a delay. I just want to, after this parent is done animating, I want to just animate the list. So I don't want to provide a delay. So what we can do right now, let me just show you what happens if we don't provide that delay. They both basically animate at the same time. And at the end of the day, it kind of seems like it's coming together. So essentially what we want to say is, okay, well, after this animation is done, then I want to animate the parent. So what we can actually do is inside of this variant, inside of this particular transition, we can basically say the when keyword. And over here, we can basically say we want to animate, we want to complete this animation before the children begin to animate. So we can say before children. So now what we can do is over here, without defining any delay inside of the variant, hover over it, and you can see that we get that cool animation. All right, cool. Now the last thing that we can do is basically stagger the children. So we can say that, okay, well, we want to animate these in a staggered way. So each child is going to have their own kind of unique animation. That is very, very simple. We can basically use stagger children, and then we can provide a time. So we can say, well, we want to stagger them. We want to basically have each child have a 2-second animation, and then the next child can go ahead and start animating. So you can see here, you can see that we get that cool effect. All right, so I hope that makes sense. This is one of the more confusing ones. The other ones I think are going to be relatively easy, but this is a really cool concept. Again, this allows you to create really complex animations, like the one that we saw with the basically that nav bar. So I hope that makes sense, and that is pretty much it. Let's go ahead and move on to box number 4. Okay, so now let's move on to the 4th box, and this box is going to introduce a new concept called keyframes. Now, I'm sure you guys are already familiar with keyframes. This is a very popular concept in CSS, and we can actually use keyframes very easily in Framer Motion to have animations, really cool animations that look something like this. So this is really cool animations. You can see here that it moves to the right a little bit and it changes into a circle, then it moves back to the left. So this is some really cool animations that we can do very easily with Framer Motions through keychains. So let's actually go ahead and let's just build this out. So to do this, of course, we need to create another box. So let's create box 4. And then in here, we're going to create a box4.jsx. And then let's go ahead and let's just copy our template from box 1. Just copy that in there. Let's get rid of all of these props and events. Let's get rid of this, use state. And let's just go ahead and change this to box 4. Not that it really matters. Let's go over here now. And let's just say, hey, we want box 4. Notice how it auto imports. If you want, you can go ahead and import it yourself. All right, this is a very simple box. We have this box right over here, but we want this really cool keyframe animation. And we can actually do that with arrays. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. So in here, what we can basically do is, of course, define the animate. Now we can put this in a variant if we want to, but I'm just gonna, for simplicity's sake, just put it inside of a just the animate prop. And basically what we can say here is we can say multiple different things. So remember how this animation is doing. It's getting bigger, and then it's rotating, and then, you know, changing the radius. So over here, remember, we can define the scale to make things bigger. So we can say that, hey, we want to increase the scale to 1.4. And then we can say, okay, well, we want to have more animations, but this is a little bit more complicated. This animation, you can see here that we're changing the scale and then we're decreasing the scale. And over here, we're changing the radius and then we're rechanging the radius to something else. We're rotating it one way and then we're rotating it another way. To be able to do all this, what we can basically do, instead of defining a particular value, we can actually define an array of values. So we can say initially, hey, we want this to be 1, and then we want this to be 0.4, and then we want this to be 4, and then we want this to be 1 again, and then we want this to be 3, and then we want it to go back to 1. And then over here, we can also define inside of the transition, or sorry, outside of the animate, we can also just define the transition. And let's just define that, hey, we want this ultimate animation to have a duration of 2 seconds. So over here, you can see that it's going to basically animate to each particular scale, and the final duration is going to be 2 seconds. So over here, you can see we get this really wonky animation. And you can see very quickly that how we can basically get this very cool animation very easily. So let's actually do that right now. So let's actually go ahead and let's just quickly observe this. So it seems like, okay, it's initially at 1, and then it gets a little bit bigger, gets back to normal, and that's pretty much it. So it gets a little bit bigger, then goes back to normal. So let's say that, okay, so initially we're gonna say that it's 1, and and then it's going to get bigger to 0.4, and then let's just say that it stays at 0.4 for a little bit longer, because you can see here that so it's 0.4, and then you can see that it turns into a circle and still at 0.4, and then it goes back to 0.1, and then it goes, let's say we'll keep it at 0.1. So here what we're saying is that in this, basically the duration of 2 seconds, we want it to so 2 divided by 5, what is that? I'm really not sure. I think it's 0.4. Yeah, so the first 0.4 seconds we want it to be the scale of 1, and then the next 0.4 seconds we want it to be basically 1.4, and then we also want the next 0.4 seconds, so this is going to be 0.8 seconds total. We want it to stay at 1.4, and then we want it to go back to 1 for the next 0.8 seconds. So let's go ahead and let's just save this, just quickly illustrate this. You can see it looks a little something like this. So now what we can do is we can add other animations. For instance, what we probably want to do is we want to animate the border radius. You can see initially it's actually something like 20%, but then, you know, it goes 20, 50, and then it goes back to 20. And it seems as though that it's 50 once it also gets smaller. So it seems like it's kind of the latter half that it's also 50. So what we can say here is we can say that we want the border radius to be also an array, and this array is going to have the same number of values in here. So it's also going to have 5 values, because over here we have 5 values. So we're going to say here that we want initially the border radius to be 20, and then what we can also say is maybe the next one is 20, so the first 0.8 seconds is 20, and then once we maybe reach this part over here, we're going to make it 50, so we're going to turn it into a circle. So we're going to turn it into a circle, and then as you can see it gets smaller, but we're going to keep it at 50 once it gets smaller. So we're going to keep it at 50, and then we're going to turn it to back to 20. So we can see here, if I were to refresh this, you can see that we get that animation. All right, cool, awesome. So now let's just go ahead and let's perform the rotation. The rotation is going to be very, very similar. So let's go over here, let's do the rotation. And you can always play around with this. I kind of just, I played around with this beforehand, and these are kind of the values that I came up with that really worked. So initially we're gonna have no rotation for the first 0.8 seconds. And then we're gonna do a rotation of 270. So it's gonna move it 270 in one direction, 270 in the next direction, and then we're going to do 0 rotation. And ultimately, we're going to save this, and you can see that we get this really cool animation. All right, cool. Now these values, again, you can always play around with. I just really played around with it, and that's the one that we got. All right, so that's pretty much it. That's a very simple, powerful animation that we can do with framer motion and keyframes. So these guys cannot, they don't have to also be just straight up values. It can also be an array of values. And that basically means that, hey, this is going to be a keyframe. All right, so that is pretty much it. And remember, each value over here is basically dependent on this duration. So if I were to change this to 10 seconds, then each value here is going to be 2 seconds. So it's initially going to be 1 second 1, and then it's going to animate to this, and then that. And you can see that it's actually kind of cool, these animations. So I'm going to move it back to 2. All right, that is pretty much it. The last one is the really cool one, and probably the one that you guys want to see the most. So this really cool animation, we can stop it whenever. And we can actually really do this very easily with actual a framer motion hook that is provided to us. Finally, let's move on to the last box, and this box is going to introduce a new concept through the useAnimate hook. Now remember what this box is ultimately going to do. We're going to be able to click on buttons, and it's going to animate this particular element the way that we want it to. Now we kind of did it with this initial box over here, but the way we did it was through the useState hook, which is a React hook, and it was kind of a hacky way of doing it. There's actually a better way to animate elements through events, like, click events on particular elements through the useAnimation hook. And let's actually basically create this element over here, and then let's start using the useAnimation hook. So as usual, we're going to need to create a new box. So it's going to say box 5. In here, we're going to create a new JSX element called box 5. We're going to go ahead and just, as usual, just copy the boilerplate in box 1, paste it in here, change this to box 5, get rid of this hook. And actually, you know what? Let's actually just explore this, because this is pretty much what we're doing. So over here on a click event, what we're doing is we're basically changing the state, and then we're changing the animate. And this is pretty hacky. I personally don't really like doing this way, and mainly because there's a much better way of doing it. And that's, again, using the useAnimate hook. So let's actually go ahead and let's do that right now. So let's go over here and let's go to the app.js, and let's just import box 5. Notice that it auto imports, and let's go ahead and just create those buttons. So we have a bunch of buttons that we can create. So we're gonna say button, and we're gonna say this first button is to move to the right. So move to the right. And then we're also gonna have another button, another button, and another button. This one move to the left. This one is to make things, or to turn things into a circle. And this one is to turn it into a square again. And then also let's have our last button for just stopping the animation at whole. And we can actually see how easy this ultimately is. Now, before we do this, let's just go to our or our app.css, and let's just style those buttons just so we can make them a little bit prettier. Not really all that important, but I like to do that. So let's go here, button, and how are these styles over here? Let's just quickly look at these styles. So it seems like the color is white. It seems like there is no border, which is cool. And we have a background color. All right, so let's kind of think about these styles. I think that's it. There is no hover styles, which is okay, that's fine. All right, so let's move on, and let's just say that we want the color to be white. So we want that color to be white, and this is going to be the color of the font, of course. And then we want the padding to be 1 rem. We want, let's have a margin right of 1.5 rem, a margin bottom of 3 rems. And then let's also give it a border of none. Let's give it a background color of, let's say RGB 48. I'm just looking at my notes here. 155 and then 197. That's the blue color. Let's also give it a font size of 1.25 rem. And then let's give it a font weight of 700. So there's just some simple styles just to make our button look a little bit nicer. Let's also give it a width, just a fixed width of 15 rems, just so it can be kind of consistent. Now, of course, when we click on this, nothing happens. Lastly, let's just give it a cursor pointer so we can have that pointer cursor. Okay, cool. So now what we want to do is we want to animate this to the right when we click on this button. So how do we go about doing that? Now again, the way that we did it in the very first box, doing these kind of animations will be difficult if we have to do it in a hacky manual way. And we actually don't want to do it in a hacky manual way. We actually want to basically be able to control the animation in some way. And again, what we can do is do that through the useAnimate hook. So we can say use animation, sorry, not use animate, use animation. And essentially now what we can basically say is define a controller using the useAnimate hook. So we can say control, and then we can basically say useAnimate. And basically this is ultimately what is going to be controlling the animation. So in here, what we can do is we can basically define animate is equal to the control. Now, how do we define our animation? Well, now what we can do is basically on a click. So let's say we want to click on this button, and this is going to obviously call a callback. And basically on a click, what we ultimately are going to want to do is use control, and we want to start an animation. And so over here we can say dot start. And then over here, as usual, we can just define a simple animation. So we can say we want to move X, we want to move 150X. And then over here, we can also maybe define a transition. So we can define whatever it is that we want. This is going to be similar to what we already learned. So over here, we can say that the duration is going to be 20. So now what we can do is we can click on this, and you can see that it moves to the right. And of course, now we can do the exact same thing with the other buttons. So let's go ahead and let's just copy this animation, or this callback. Let's go ahead over here and let's copy that. I don't know where it starts and where it ends. I believe it starts and ends here. And let's go here and let's just paste that in there. And now we want to move this back to 0. So now what we can see is, if we refresh this, we can click and we can move this back to 0. And what's cool is, what's happening is, okay, it's starting this animation. So it starts this animation. But then when I click on this button, it immediately ends this animation and starts this one. And that's why basically what's happening is, well, it doesn't really immediately end it, but if it's basically contrasting, what it does is that, yes, it stops this animation and then it moves on to the next one. So you can see here that it's working fine and dandy. And again, we can now add other animations. So we can add the circle, we can have an on click. This is not really that pretty. It might be better if we just do something like this, but it's fine for now. We can also say for the circle, maybe ultimately what we want to do for the circle is change the border radius. So maybe the border radius, and we want to change that to 50% to make it a circle. And then over here, we can basically move this right back to where it was. So the border radius, maybe have the duration be 1 for this. And over here we can say the border radius is 0. So back to a square. All right, cool. So we can actually move this to the right, left, circle, square, all that cool stuff. Now, how do we stop it? Well, stopping it is even easier than animating it. In the stop button, we can have an on click, and this can call a callback, of course. And over here, we can just simply say control.stop the animation. So stop. And we can just go ahead and call that. And that's pretty much it. So now we can move it to the right, stop it, circle, stop it, square, stop it, left, circle, square, square, and then back to a circle. I'm trying to like change it back to a square, move it to the left, or move it to the right, circle, then stop it. You can stop it midway. And you can move it back to the left if you want. And that's pretty much it. And it's really, really cool and really powerful. So that's pretty much it for Framer Motion. I hope all these illustrations you can use in your own application now. And I'll see you guys in the next one.